It is such an honor to welcome you to our National First Amendment Teach-In and the opening of our new First Amendment Gallery. And it's so meaningful to be standing here in front of the shining words of the First Amendment. And let's inspire ourselves for the conversation ahead by now gazing at Independence Hall, the room where it happened, the birthplace of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, which gave rise to the shining protections for freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, and petition that we're here to celebrate today. Friends, please visit the First Amendment Gallery before you leave. And when you do, in this magnificent new space, you'll see two documents at the beginning of the exhibit. Thomas Jefferson's Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom in Virginia, and Louis Brandeis's great defense of free speech in Whitney versus California. And you'll see at the beginning of the exhibit Jefferson praising what he called the illimitable freedom of the human mind, based on the principle that, as he put it, the opinions of people, being dependent on evidence contemplated by their own minds, cannot be controlled by others. Freedom of speech and opinion is a natural right, he said, because our opinions are the product of our reason, and our reason cannot be alienated or surrendered to any king or tyrant or fellow citizen. We have the right and the duty to think as we will and speak as we think, as Jefferson said, quoting the great Roman historian Tacitus. And then Louis Brandeis, in his Whitney in California opinion, channeled Jefferson's beautiful words and insisted that the freedom to think as we will and speak as we think is at the core of the First Amendment. Today, we've assembled some of the greatest scholars and thinkers about the First Amendment in America to examine the historic roots of those words, their contemporary contestations in the courts, and how they're playing out online. And I need to thank our incredible partners for having assembled this national celebration and defense of the First Amendment. And they include, I need my constitutional reading glasses to make sure I have all of them. The First Amendment Watch at NYU, FIRE, the Great Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, the Freedom Forum, PEN America, and the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. And I'm so grateful to Steve Solomon at NYU's First Amendment Watch for having had the brilliant idea that led to us convening today. Friends, we are extraordinarily honored to begin our convocation by hearing from one of the great free speech heroes in the world today. It's so meaningful that Salman Rushdie has agreed to share with us his thoughts on threats to freedom of expression. No figure in the globe more powerfully reminds us of the wickedness of those who would try to suppress blasphemy and heresy with violence, and the shining need to defend principles of free speech against all forces of illiberalism and suppression. And joining us to interview Salman Rushdie is a great defender of free speech and a great friend of the National Constitution Center, Suzanne Nossel, the visionary head of PEN America. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Suzanne Nossel and Salman Rushdie.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. Hello. Hi, Salman.
Hi. Hello,
Great
everybody.
to see you.
That's very nice. You should sit down.
It's great to be here for this auspicious event, and thank you so much to Steve and Jeff and everybody who has made it possible. So, Salman, to begin, I mean, I think of that incredibly inspiring moment when, in your first appearance publicly since the attack, you came to the PEN America Gala and inspired us with your words and talked about those who helped save your life when you were attacked last summer And you ended your remarks saying, La lutte continue, and putting your fist up in the air. And it was sort of just this rousing moment that we are of a reminder that we are in this fight for the long term. And to begin with, I wanted just your overview of the horizon and what you see as the major threats to free speech and press today here in the US and around the world.
Well, first of all, let me just say I'm really happy to be a part of this important event, and thank you for having me. You know, the First Amendment was one of the reasons why I decided to come and live in America. You know, it was one of the great American values that made me think that's a place I'd like to live, if those are the values of the society. And I had always assumed that that would be something which all Americans would, so to speak, hold sacred. And you ask about what the problems nowadays are. I mean, if you'd asked me 10 or 20 years ago, I would probably have said that the main problems facing freedom of expression emanate from religious extremism, you know, from of all kinds, from Islamic extremism, which I have some personal experience of, but also Hindu fanaticism in India and Christian extremism in this country. The destruction of Roe v. Wade being an example of what that could do. I'm not sure that I would give that answer in the same way now, because in a way it feels like a kind of 18th century answer. It feels as if we're still fighting the Enlightenment fighting against what was then the main enemy of free expression, which was the church, more than the state. I think now we're facing another old enemy, which is authoritarianism. I think there's a real rise in authoritarian movements around the world, populist authoritarian demagoguery, and coupled with that, a willingness amongst at least some part of the population to cease to value the democratic values enshrined in the First Amendment. So I think the problem is, I would now say, political more than primarily religious.
And how do you make sense of the ways in which, even in this country, these authoritarian tendencies and a readiness to, for example, ban books, enact laws that circumscribe what can be taught in the college classroom, you know, how has that taken hold in this place that you came to as a beacon not so long ago? How do you explain it, and how do we get past it?
I find it bewildering, and I think it has to do with two kinds of attack that have been unleashed, not unsuccessfully in recent years. One is on the idea of education itself. I mean, I remember seeing some years ago a survey carried out amongst Republican voters, in which something like 2/3 of them subscribed to the idea that universities were bad for America, because they were places where people were indoctrinated with, you know, communism and so forth. That's one thing. The other thing is the thing that you and I, Suzanne, have talked about a lot, which is the assault on the idea of the truth. Because one of the preconditions for the rise of authoritarian strongmen is that people cease to believe in the truth. People are told so often that everything they're being told is a lie, that they begin to internalize that. And at that point, the demagogue, the authoritarian, can rise to his feet and can say, I am the truth. Believe me, because I am the truth. That's how dictatorships start. That's how tyrannies rise. And we're seeing phenomena like that in this country, but around the world as well. You know, and those two attacks on education, on the value of education, and on the absolute value of the truth, are unfortunately have been to some degree successful.
Shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about censoriousness emanating from the left. At PEN America, we've spent a lot of time and energy trying to set out how the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion can and must be reconciled with free speech. And to us, it seems crucially important because the rising generation in this country too often sees free speech and the First Amendment as a smokescreen for hatred. And we feel if we don't explain how these ideals can fit together, how free speech protections can enable the movements that young people are waging, we are at risk of free speech losing its moorings in our society. But in dialogue with you sometimes over the years, I wonder whether you feel that's the right approach or whether you think it's something of a distraction or a detraction from the unflinching defense of free speech. Do you ultimately think these values can be reconciled?
I hope so. I hope so. And I do think that's the problem that you described, the problem of the kind of progressive attack on free speech is, so far anyway, seems to be a province of the very young. So there's a bit of me that thinks maybe they'll grow out of it. I do think that different countries define free expression differently. So that, for example, when I was living in the UK for a long time, the UK has a thing called the Race Relations Act. The Race Relations Act makes it illegal to make racially charged remarks. You can be prosecuted and sent to jail. And when I lived in England, I didn't see anything much wrong with that. I thought, okay, racism is against the law. Why not? The First Amendment defines speech more broadly than that. And when I moved to America, I came to appreciate that. I came to think, okay, let's hear all the voices so that we know where the bastards are, so that we can fight back against them. But I can understand both arguments. I do think to this day in the UK, people on the left and the right value the Race Relations Act. It's seen as being worth it. So I think one of the things that maybe might be worth debating in this convention is that question about whose definition of free expression works best in the current climate. For example, in Germany, it's a crime. Holocaust denial is a crime. And I mean, you can see why, given the history of Germany. My view is that that's a real mistake. That Holocaust denial doesn't disappear by being made illegal, and in some way it acquires the glamour of taboo. Forbidden things are glamorous, and I think Holocaust denial should be presented as being astonishingly unglamorous, which it is. So what I'm saying is that there isn't simply a thing called free expression. Individual Western societies have made up their own minds about where that line should be drawn. And I've always liked the very broad definitions of the United States. I do think there are problems arising out of new technology. There are problems based on what the internet makes possible, and there are problems based on what social media make possible. So the abuses of free expression that are rampant on the internet and on social media do create a problem for us, and I think I'm not even sure what my answer to that is. But it's something we need to seriously think about.
Yeah, I wanted to. I mean, when you mentioned Holocaust denial, one thing that comes to my mind is, in addition to the points you raised about why it's problematic to try to suppress it and how that doesn't ultimately work, it also becomes a template. And when I worked at the U.S. State Department, we were trying to fend off an effort at a global ban on the defamation of religion. And one of the prime arguments that the Islamic countries brought forward was that in many countries, Holocaust denial is banned. And if you're going to ban that which is offensive to Jews or might fan anti-Semitism, why won't you ban that which is offensive to us and might fan anti-Muslim sentiment? And we always, as the US, had a very good argument, which is we wouldn't permit the banning of Holocaust denial in this country. And that ultimately, I think, made a big difference. It would have been a much harder fight to win if that prohibition was universal. But I want to come back to the question of social media, because I think this is a real dilemma. I think we all basically accept far more restriction, the notion that far more restriction of speech on social media is legitimate, that the kind of community standards that a platform like Facebook or Instagram has, or the rules of the road that Twitter traditionally had, allow those platforms to be functional, allow a real give and take that doesn't become just a race to the bottom in terms of vitriol and disinformation, taking over the platform, doing what you described in terms of an underpinning of authoritarian societies where you can't ferret out the truth. There's no root to truth. It's so flooded with disinformation, no one can figure out what to believe. But the question is, there have also been very staunch kind of backlash against some of those restrictions. People arguing that speech is being suppressed on conservative versus liberal lines, that important topics about the vaccines and COVID and the origins of COVID have been suppressed, the interplay between government and social media companies. So I wonder, Elon Musk is sort of throwing those rules out the window and making his forum much more of a free-for-all. Is your instinct that that's the right answer, or that we somehow have to muddle through and develop these kind of ever more elaborate rules to try to govern what is and isn't permissible on social media? And I ask you also as someone who's active on Twitter and on Facebook and does engage in dialogue in those fora.
I mean, I engage a little bit. What I have found is that increasingly it's become an unpleasant place to be. I feel that whatever you should call this, I mean, I don't, X, feels like a room you don't want to be in, a room full of people you don't want to talk to. And so I go on relatively little. I do sometimes think that all other media, broadcast or print, all other media are subject to a certain kind of regulation, which is to say, an editorial regulation. That's to say that books, television programs, radio, films are held to be editorially responsible for their content, and this is why publishing companies have book editors as opposed to just pushing out anything that anybody sends them. This is why newspapers have book editors. And for example, in the fight that we were involved in about the Charlie Hebdo murders, the editorial decisions of a magazine like that are often disagreed with by members of the magazine. But the buck stops somewhere. There is in the end an editor's desk who has to make choices. And that is true of every single other medium that has ever existed, print or broadcast. Now we have this new thing which functions like the Wild West, where you can ride into Dodge with a gun because, hey, we believe in freedom. So the question is whether some of the principles that govern all other media can somehow be applied to these new media. And I by no means equipped to answer how, because it's a really difficult problem. But I do think there's something that needs to be really thought about, because it's not true in any other form of expression that you can just shoot your mouth off without consequences.
Right. I mean, if you go back to the early days of the internet, that ability that it affords to just shoot your mouth off, immediately and reach an audience, sometimes of hundreds of thousands or even millions, if what you've said or what you've shown is potent enough, that was seen as a great boon to free expression. Those
Yeah.
barriers, having to get the New York Times op-ed editor to greenlight your piece or get a publishing contract, there was another route, and that was celebrated, and it has enabled an enormous amount of expression. But now we face, not just with social media, but with AI and large language models, the very nature of these services is that immediacy, is the fact that there's no intermediary, there's no editor that you send it to. These posts are not reviewed before they, make it out into the world. With ChatGPT, it's automated. You could never execute on that in any other way. And so I guess, what do you think about that balance? Do you think there's still something to that idea that the accessibility of these platforms and the reach that you can attain is a positive that as a society we need to try to preserve, or has it tipped over? And so that it's really more negative than positive at this point, and we ought to try to rein them in and make them look more like book or magazine publishing.
I think both things are true. I think it is true that things like Twitter have value. For example, with a rapidly breaking news story, you very often find out what's happening faster on something like Twitter than you do from any other source. Also, in various moments of political upheaval, such as I'm thinking of, for example, the Arab Spring, the use of Twitter was incredibly important to the demonstrators in that moment, and got the news out to the rest of us in the world about what they were trying to do and what they stood for, and etc. So there's no question that there is value. The question is how that can be protected from drowning in a kind of sea of vitriol and lies. And this is the question that we face, because I think it's a question that has enormous democratic consequences. And I wish I knew the answer, but at least I can ask the question.
I want to ask you a little bit about institutions and, both how you see these threats to free speech affecting our democratic institutions, elections, the functioning of a body like the United States Congress, the role of the executive branch and a presidency kind of amid these buffeting tensions and the erosion of truth. What is at stake, and how can we fortify our institutions? Sometimes I get frustrated because the conversation about democracy often doesn't even seem to reference free speech. It's all about, free and fair elections, and of course that's incredibly important, and voting rights, and yet free speech is an underpinning that I feel is almost sort of being lost in this mortal debate over how we save our democracy.
Yeah, well, it is a mortal debate, and I think one of the problems is that you have essentially only one major political party that seems to believe in democratic values now. And you have another one that seems to be doing everything it can to undermine them. When you have the large majority of Republican voters believing that the last election was stolen, as they do every time they're asked, it's a very large majority of Republican voters believe that Donald Trump won the last election, and that he was cheated of his victory. Now, if the assault on the truth has reached that level of success, then we're in real trouble. And I mean, I've always believed, and I think just about I still believe, that the answer to speech is more speech, that the answer to wrong speech is better speech. And I do think that that's what we have to get better at doing. We have to get better at combating this tidal wave of misinformation, disinformation, by telling the truth. And I mean, when we had our Penn meeting at the United Nations, one of the things that I was trying to say there was that what's happening actually is quite a literary thing. It's a battle of narratives. That you have all over the world false narratives being propounded quite cold-bloodedly in order to make possible certain kinds of actions in the present moment. And Make America Great Again has always made me want to ask, when exactly was that? What was the date to which we are looking backwards? Was it, for example, when there was slavery? Was it before women had the vote? Was it before the civil rights movement? Exactly which is the American greatness to which we must return? Because, of course, it's just simply, it's a golden age myth. And the thing about the golden age is that it never existed. And the myth of the golden age is always used to justify actions in the present. In England, the Brexit catastrophe was the result of another golden age myth, which is that England used to be this glorious country, and it could be that glorious country again if only we could get rid of all these foreigners. And that didn't work very well because, of course, they neglected to mention to their population, their electorate, that the reason England was so prosperous was that it had spent 200 years plundering the rest of the world. In India now, there's a golden age myth, which is that India was a wonderful place before the Muslims arrived. And that if it could go back to that purely Hindu nation, everything would be better. This allows all kinds of sectarian violence to be taking place in the present day. So wherever you look, you see narratives being pushed, which are dangerous narratives. And we are the keepers of narrative. It's our job, journalists and writers, and we have to just become a whole lot better at providing counter-narratives.
We have to wrap in a minute, but I want to push you a little bit on that and ask, what does it actually look like to construct and promulgate a narrative that can, I take your point about the golden age, but I also think about how we began this conversation. You're saying that you came here in part because of the First Amendment, and this hall and this museum is about the Constitution, and I think we're all here in part because we actually do believe there's something valuable. Maybe there was no perfect moment, but there were some ideas and then some institutions that worked better than just about any alternative that you could imagine when they were working at their best. So how do we, as we look forward, what is the narrative that we can construct about the future that has some hope of getting people beyond, what you've called me, described to me as people being defined by that which offends them. What is the affirmative narrative, or where should we look? Where do we grope to begin to construct that?
I don't know. It's very hard to get people to celebrate the positive. Much easier to get them to denigrate what they think of as negative. It's unfortunate characteristic of human nature that it's easier to attack than to defend. And if what we're trying to do is defend values, which you rightly say, I'm sure everybody assembled in that room believes in, all you can do is do it, and what you have to do is win the arguments. And that means having people who are good at arguing. And to do that, it's not going to be overnight. It might be a generational thing. And you have to persuade young people that it's worth it. I mean, that's it seems to me the danger to me is young people ceasing to believe in First Amendment values and preferring the idea that all sorts of speech should be prevented because they don't like it, or it represents values which they don't hold. But the whole point, I mean, I've said this to any number of student audiences, and they always look a little bewildered, that the defense of free speech begins when somebody says something you don't like. That it's perfectly easy to defend speech with which you agree or which seems to you to be irrelevant. The defense, when you discover if you're in favor of free speech, is precisely when somebody says something you don't like, and the more extremely you don't like it, the more it questions whether you believe in free speech or not. So free speech is the defense of speech you don't like. And we have to persuade people of that in this age of offendedness, this age of outrage identity. That has to come to an end. It's too easy to define yourself by what outrages you. It's necessary for us to understand that you have to allow the speech of those you don't like.
Well, Salman, you embody the courage to say that which others may not like and to hold your ground come what may and no matter what. And so your courage is inspiring, and your charge to all of us to turn around this narrative is potent. So thank you so much for joining us here today and being with us.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so happy to have been able to do it. Thank you very much.